Welcome to the show today. Megan Basham joins the show today. Appropriate last name, for she has been bashing him. All of the big evangelical theological betters that we thought we could trust in the church, who are strangely silent in these evil days, or they do this thing and they only punch right. They only punch others who are allegedly on the same conservative side of the aisle with them, trying to stop some of the insanity against our children and babies in the family in America. But they're strangely silent when the woke left, who might even call themselves Christians, do things truly evil and wicked. Megan Basham wrote an article for the Daily Wire in 2022 called How the Federal Government Used Evangelical Leaders to Spread COVID Propaganda. And when she wrote this article, Big Eva started collapsing in on itself like a dying star. For she exposed and indicted people for participating in wickedness that they never repented for, never acknowledged, never said sorry for. And it included people like Tim Keller, Russell Moore of Christianity Today, Rick Warren. It included people like Ed Stetzer, the new dean of Biola University Seminary, and many, many more men who people yell at me for if I attack them. But we don't understand what Vodi Bakum meant by the fault lines. There are fault lines in the evangelical church, and they're getting larger and larger and larger, and people are falling in the middle of these fault lines. And if we can't diagnose these problems of cowardice, of syncretism, of evil, of refusal to preach false doctrine, true good doctrine, of refusal to preach against false doctrine, or exposing people that might be getting dark money from very bad, evil, demonically inspired actors so that they can be spoken well of by the Biden administration. If we can't diagnose these things, then we are in deep doo-doo as the American church. If we can't look in the mirror and acknowledge our own faults and failures and be able to weed out those among us who should be called wolves in sheep's clothing. Nobody in the last 2 or 3 years has done better work to graciously but boldly educate the church on these matters than Megan Basham. She's the voice on the Morning Wire at Daily Wire. She's a reporter and journalist for the Daily Wire, and her new book, it comes out at the end of the month. You're going to want to pick up this book. It's called Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. I got an early advance copy. This thing is more heavily cited than anything I've seen in a long, long time. You need to pick up a copy of this book. We welcome Megan Basham to the show today to talk about the shepherds of America who seem to be for sale to any leftist political agenda that the left needs Christians to platform and push forward. This will be a illuminating and uncomfortable conversation, but you need to listen to Megan Basham today. Thank you for joining the Seth Gruber Show. Megan, welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Seth. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks. It's fun to become recent friends with you and running in similar circles. I'm telling everyone it feels like there's about 2 degrees of separation from almost everyone who's actually in the fight, meaning you won't diddle the kids, you won't lower the age of consent, you won't murder babies, you won't shut down the church, you won't force me to take an experimental thing. Screw you, and we're going to do something about it. I'm talking about the people who are in that movement. It's like, regardless of where you fall theologically, it feels like there's 2 degrees of separation from everyone now. And so we're just so grateful for what you're doing. I've talked about you on this show. We did an episode a couple weeks ago that took off on YouTube about Big Eva, and nobody's probably done more in the past couple years to, unfortunately, expose a lot of the bad actors, cowards, or dare I say even evil men that used to be known as faithful Christian gospel preachers, leading Christian institutions or churches or writing books, who were known for rightly dividing the word of truth. And yet their cooperation with evil in the last few years is incredibly disturbing. It's hard to sometimes put language to, but you've done that in your book that comes out this month, Shepherds for Sale. There's so much to talk about here because I followed your work closer than most. But I would love for you to share with people, was there a moment when you realized, oh my gosh, we have deeper problems than secular progressivism attacking the church? We have a problem of wolves in the church, but all the Christians love them. I thought, did you have a wake up moment that eventually led you on this campaign to expose the deeds of darkness?
Yeah, so there was very much a moment, and I think like a lot of people, it really came in COVID. So I think before that there was a sense of disquiet. A lot of us were feeling things that felt a little bit off when it came to issues like racial grievance that seemed to be being peddled from a lot of well-known, high-profile church leaders, but we weren't quite sure where that was coming from. I think like a lot of people, I checked my own heart and went, gosh, I don't know, Lord, am I getting this wrong? Why am I not agreeing with, what some of these really well-respected people like Tim Keller are saying? Same thing when they were pushing open borders policies, saying that welcome the stranger in the New Testament means that we have to honor all honest amnesty claims. I mean, just some really bizarre application of scripture. But I think, like a lot of people, the initial reaction was to go, well, gosh, I just disagree. I'm not quite sure where they're coming from. And then COVID happened. And it kind of threw all of it into sharp relief, where you went, suddenly something is really off base in the church, because it was no longer like, I just don't really see what they're saying. It was, you are directly defying scripture, which tells us not to give up meeting together in order to push government COVID narratives. And so I think for so many people seeing that, that was the moment where we realized, no, something is really rotten in the church. Something is really off base and it needs to be addressed. And in a weird way, I tend to look at that as the blessing of COVID, because it woke so many of us up to the fact that we knew we had a problem. Because at the same time that you had church leaders doing that, they were also joining BLM marches and things of that nature. So there was just no defense for that. And I think for so many of us, that was a scales off the eyes moment.
Yeah, Megan, I often say that I'm grateful for COVID because it showed who's who in the zoo. Now, I grew up in Southern California. I was a homeschool kid, and I grew up probably 45 minutes from Saddleback Church. Mm-hmm. And I had criticized people like Rick Warren and others going back to 2018, 2019, 2017. For their silence on issues that were so blatantly opposed to the Word of God, but they weren't like overtly woke. They weren't like overtly syncretized by some kind of neo-paganism. Now it is quite overt. And 2020 really became that awakening moment. Now, you wrote this article, and I've referred to it on the show for the people that listen to the show, called How the Federal Government Used Evangelical Leaders to Spread COVID Propaganda, at the Daily Wire. And this article validated all of my concerns. It was just way worse than I had ever realized. And now you've got one of those figures, Ed Stetzer, as the dean of Talbot Theological Seminary, which is Biola University's flagship seminary. This is so insane. And now I'm losing friends because I keep platforming your article, going after the men you've exposed. And it's like, wow, I guess we know who's who now. So I want you to talk about exactly how bad it is. Your book now that's coming out this month, Shepherds for Hire, how evangelical ministers traded the truth for a leftist agenda, is really like beefing out all the research that you've done. And it's such an important thing you've done for the church. And my mentor, Dr. George Grant, who's in my film and book, The 1916 Project, just awarded you the Boniface Award at the conference in Atlanta. Well-deserved. Congratulations, Megan. But I want you to maybe, off the top of your head, I don't actually have a direction I want you to go. I want you to just speak from the heart right now. How bad is the compromised nature of our evangelical betters?
Well, I would say it's pretty bad. But, I don't want to be too negative because I think that the positive is that a lot of people are seeing it now, and you're seeing some young leadership rise up and push back in a way that they haven't until really the last few years. So I think that's the positive that we can take from this. But the reality is this, is it's not just that there has been compromise based on fear of man, which is bad enough. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, but there's also been some very deliberate entanglement with secular left organizations taking their funding, doing their bidding. So, what we're seeing is evangelical front groups being established to push progressive policies into churches, into ministries, onto Christian campuses.
I was told that's a conspiracy theory, Megan. That
Well,
that's
that
that's
is why
that's
I
not
have
happening.
so many footnotes in my book so that you could not deny it. Because here's the reality: IRS 990s don't lie. You can pull them up, you can follow some of this money. And to give you just one example that really kind of makes me laugh a little bit, but also cry a little bit, is looking at, for example, Baptist Press, ERLC, some other organizations saying, no, 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 no. This evangelical immigration table never took money from George Soros. That's a conspiracy theory. And that was very much promoted in what you would call the evangelical establishment, that bad actors were just pushing this conspiracy theory. Well, when you dig down in it, what you find is one, this organization, the Evangelical Immigration Table, is housed in the National Immigration Forum, which is a secular left immigration policy group that is pushing things like amnesty policies, pushing the purchasing of legal status for those who are here illegally. And we can have a lot of debate over those policies, but what we shouldn't be able to debate is the fact that scripture does not require us to back that. And that was what they were claiming. And so when I dug down, you find out that not only does George Soros's foundation in its own documents admit that, yes, we gave money to this program that the Evangelical Immigration Table is a part of, they specifically cite evangelicals and Southern Baptists. They celebrate the fact that the National Immigration Forum got us access to this group that we really wanted to co opt to get this policy passed. So there's really no question that it's happening. And I could give you examples on any number of fronts. So when you look at this issue of the National Immigration Forum housing the Evangelical Immigration Table, and not only is it taking money from a number of secular left-wing foundations, but it was very clear that this organization, which is supported by any number of Southern Baptist presidents, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is heavily involved in it. The Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the National Association of Evangelicals. I could go on and on. What we found then is that this money from George Soros was absolutely going to it. So it wasn't just that they took money from George Soros for this project that the Evangelical Immigration Table was involved in. It was then that they did what you had to call was an AstroTurf campaign to lie about the fact that they were taking this money.
Wow. Yeah, geez Louise. I have, and it's so funny because I had pastor friends of mine who are real warriors tell me years ago that there is Open Society Foundation through George Soros going to some evangelical organizations. And I remember back then in 2020 being like, and I'm pretty red pilled, and I was like, I don't know about that. And now it's just like, well, here, who can actually argue with your receipts? And it's extremely concerning. It makes me remember, and this is what I want to ask you about. There's so many things I want to ask you, Megan, but tell us about the Afterparty. This seems to be another left-wing funded, quote unquote, evangelical project, which in my opinion seems to be an attempt to castrate pastors further and give them a gospel-centered, pious excuse to abdicate politically and lay over so that the left can walk over them. Just my hot take. But tell us about the Afterparty. Is there weird funding with that? Who's behind it? What's the goal? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and that is perfectly emblematic of so many things I write about in this book. So we know, of course, it is an election year. And the after party was started in late 2023. This is what you might call a Bible study curriculum designed to be brought into churches and Christian ministries and onto Christian college campuses to teach believers how to better engage with politics. Now, let me tell you who created this curriculum. Russell Moore, who is, of course, a confirmed never Trumper, David French, who recently endorsed Biden over Trump, and Duke Divinity professor Curtis Chang, who is himself a Democrat and never Trumper. So when you look at this curriculum, you go, one, it clearly has only one political point of view. So the idea that it is nonpartisan is undermined just by virtue of who created this program. And then second, when you look at who is funding the program, you go, it's not Christians. So this Bible study curriculum on politics that's being brought into churches was not funded by Christians. It was funded by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. So the Rockefellers. Now, if you're not familiar with them, they fund other things like the gender and reproductive, I don't even remember the name of this organization, retrospective or something like that, but it's an organization which ensures gender affirming care for quote unquote youth. It also works for reproductive justice. And please see quotes around all of these things as I'm saying these things. These are not my terms. These are their terms. It also, the after party also took funding from the Hewlett Foundation, which if you're not familiar with them, they are the second largest funder of Planned Parenthood in the country. So try to imagine why, if you are supposedly Bible-believing Christians who are really just concerned about political polarization, why are you taking money from people like that to create this program to bring into churches? And then there is the content of the program itself. It's, I think, 6 to 8 lessons. I sat through all of them. The majority of it is pablum. There's not a lot to it. It's really just politics are very complex. We don't always know how we should vote. But there's a few issues that it says are not complex. And one of them is systemic racism. It argues that America is still systemically racist and that Christians have a biblical obligation to vote to address that problem. What they don't have a biblical obligation to vote according to is abortion. So if they're telling you that systemic racism is the issue that you must vote on, but abortion, that's a complex issue. And David French says in this that you should run from anyone who tells you how to vote on that issue. It's very clear who they're trying to get you to support, or at the very least, they're trying to suppress the traditional evangelical vote that is very motivated by issues like protecting the cause of life, which they should be from a biblical perspective.
So, Megan, I remember watching a clip of Curtis Chang advertising the after party earlier this year on stage at some event at a church or something like that. And he said the reason he did this was so that you, pastor and Christian, who puts this in your church as a small group Bible study, don't have to take arrows for addressing political issues from the pulpit. You can just say, "Oh, I don't know. It's the course. It's the Bible study we did." And he said, "Now you don't have to get angry emails." I mean, doesn't this sound like the Apostle Paul
Right.
and how he engaged
Right.
the culture? You know how afraid he was of getting back. Ah, shoot. I'm going to get angry email for being all gospel, being the full counsel of God, being too zealous. Gosh, dang it. And he goes, let us take the arrows. That's why we did this. He said, you don't need that. You don't need those angry emails in your inbox on Monday morning. Curtis Chang, who helped put this thing together with Russell Moore, a guy who, if I'm right, Megan, once said that the vaccine, the COVID jab, it's kind of like the resurrection of Jesus. That's a good analogy to understand the jab. It's like these people. So I want to go back to your article that really I put you on the scene in a major way because I've read it so many times, and you largely focus on Tim Keller, Ed Stetzer, Russell Moore, David French, and Rick Warren, and they really represent big evangelicalism. John Harris, my buddy at Conversations That Matter, says they're not Christian leaders, they're institutional managers. But and there's so many other people we could talk about, but they really come to represent what you mean and what I mean when we say Big Eva. Can you talk about this seeming man crush that major evangelical leaders had on Francis Collins, and unpack some of that for us? Because for me, it was kind of the thing that blew the top off of all of these people, really revealed them for who they are. And those are issues they've never addressed or apologized for since. Can you get into the details? Because, man, like, I thought someone was going to murder you. I thought Megan Basham was going to get Hillary Clinton after you wrote that piece.
I did hear that a lot, that, make sure everyone knows you are not a suicidal type personality. But, really, when you look at that, I want to say that Big Eva is not just a slur. It's what it does. If its purpose is not to spread the gospel, if its purpose is not to ensure that the precepts of Scripture are touching every part of our life, if its purpose instead is to repackage the respectable institutional narratives and then allow those to trickle down to the people in the pews, that's what big evangelicalism is. So it's not just a name-calling issue, it's what it does. And that's very much what we saw with Francis Collins. So first off, when you look at Francis Collins as a figure, he has for years been peddled to evangelicals as someone we should be so proud of, that he's one of us because he's in the halls of power. He was the head of the National Institutes of Health, and aren't we all so glad that we can be close to him? But then you look at what Francis Collins actually supports. And none of it is what you would expect from a serious Bible-believing Christian. He claims to be pro-life, but he has no problem with the medical trade in baby parts for experimentation and research. In fact, when the Trump administration tried to shut that down, Francis Collins worked to ensure that his department would still have access to materials like that. So that was something that should have shocked, and it should have been beyond the pale for these Christian leaders. And yet it wasn't. Why? Because he was such a luminary. He was so close to power. And so that was one piece of it. And then when Francis Collins came out with these COVID mandates, saying that there should be no religious exemption to vaccines, and when his organization put out this statement saying, love your neighbor, get the shot, Big Eva went into motion immediately promoting that message. And I think we need to remember, not only when we look back and say, hey, hindsight's 2020, we didn't know everything about the vaccine then. Okay, sure. But at the time, there were very good reasons for people to say, I don't know that I want to get an experimental vaccine. I might be a young woman of childbearing age. I might want to have children. And there is no way to know at this point how it could impact me, because there had been no long-term studies. And yet all of these preachers, pastors, leaders immediately mobilized to guilt that young woman into saying, if you don't get this shot, you're not following Jesus. And that is so appalling. I mean, that is Phariseeism at its absolute utmost. And I think that was what was so horrifying to me, was to go, they did not even in the slightest shrink back from heaping that kind of legalistic burden on people at a really vulnerable moment.
Yep. Well, Stetzer had an article in USA Today called "If You Love Your Neighbor, You Have to Get the Vaccine." That was the subtitle of his article. And you've documented, Megan, something shocking. And I cite you, and I cite this finding in my book, that when Stetzer, let me say this again, the dean of Talbot Theological Seminary, formerly the dean at Wheaton College, when he wrote an article in Christianity Today smearing Christians who believed in the lab leak theory, who believed and were saying that COVID probably came from a lab and not a wet market in Wuhan, he said that that's a lie. And then he said, and lying harms your Christian witness. Lying harms your Christian witness. And so you need to shut up. Well, then once it became clear by Biden's Department of Energy, by the way, who admitted that COVID definitely, like 99%, came from a lab, he calls up his buddies at Christianity Today and they remove the article. And so I started asking this question, Megan. I said, what does it mean, Megan, when the New York Times has more journalistic integrity than Billy Graham's flagship publication? But first, we want to thank the sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show, Every Life Diaper. Every Life Diaper Company, America's only pro-life diaper baby company, for goodness sake. Because that's what wokeism does, by the way, and secular progressivism. It rots the brain and it makes you do really, really stupid things. Stupid things like you're a baby company and so you make money by selling baby products and diapers. And so the more babies America has, the more items you sell, so the richer your business becomes. And so you begin to fund abortion and encourage your female employees to get abortions and pay for their travel expenses to go out of state. Okay, baby companies were doing this in 2021, 2022, 2023. You can't make sense of it because it's the culture of death and it's evil and demonic. Everylife.com, America's now fastest growing diaper company, stands boldly for the lives of the preborn and celebrates every life. Me and my family use Every Life diapers. We're on a subscription, and so you actually save a little more if you do the subscription model. If you go to everylife.com, promo code Seth10, to get 10% off your first order and let them know that we sent you. Listen, literally, take out your phone right now if you listen to the show and just text the person at your local pregnancy center, text the person who runs the nursery at your church or one of your associate pastors and say, hey, where is our nursery at the church getting our diapers from? We should get them from Every Life Diaper Company. Let's create a culture of life by spending our money with the companies trying to grow a culture of life. Everylife.com, promo code Seth10. Thank you for being the sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I would say the ship has sailed with Billy Graham's flagship publication a long time ago, but I think maybe a lot of people weren't aware just how bad things had gotten there. I mean, we could also go into the fact that I did some reporting showing that since 2015, with one exception, and it is the person at Christianity Today who works with subscribers and donors, every other single political donation at Christianity Today has gone to Democrats. We're talking about 72 political donations, all to Democrats. So only one exception, like last year. So look, Christianity Today is gone. I think that much is pretty evident to most people. So it really shouldn't have been surprising. But yes, when we look at the question of journalistic ethics, just making this article disappear, which, by the way, you can still find it on the Wayback Machine. And if you buy my book and you look in the footnotes, I believe that I link to it. I give you a way to read it via the Wayback Machine. But that was another journalistic issue that they had, was that your editorial staff certainly should not be donating to political candidates at all, let alone donating to political candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who is so pro-abortion. She has pushed to shut down every crisis pregnancy center across the country. So, that's pretty staggering to consider that the person in charge of the political and news coverage at Christianity Today, editor Dan Silliman, was the person who was donating to candidates like Elizabeth Warren. So I would say it's a violation of Christian ethics, but also a violation of journalistic ethics.
Wow. Oh, Megan, I've been telling people recently, and I hope you take this as a compliment, that you've got more testicles than most men in the church today. And that's a disgrace to the rest of the men in the church. Okay, so what you just said makes me want to ask you something else. You have examples of compromise and cowardice from allegedly faithful Christian pastors and leaders in your book. So many examples that I think will be, unfortunately, shocking to many. But we have to deal with this, guys. This is why you need to go buy Megan's book, Shepherds for Sale. Okay, it's all your footnotes or citations, Megan, is something like 45 or 60 pages or something like that. Okay, guys, this is what is happening in the world. It's not new. Okay, the big governments with big humanistic anti-God agendas trying to use Christians to push forward their agenda and admitting that that's what they're trying to do. Guys, this has happened before. This is why you need to get Megan's book. But your examples are so numerous and shocking to many. Can you talk about the tendencies in Big Eva to only punch right? to only punch right. And maybe start with this one. There's one story you talk about Pastor Tim Keller's repeated attempts to make sure Christians didn't vote for Trump, and then to attack Christians who did vote for Trump as being politically hungry, idolatrous, navel-gazing, pious, I don't know, cowards who just wanted to be part of like MAGA or something like this. And you talk about these examples, and yet you talk about Tim Keller's interesting silence that he had for people like Michael Ware. That was such an interesting story in your book. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, not just silence, but he was very much, I would say, a Michael Ware booster. He endorsed his book. Michael Ware featured prominently many times on the Gospel Coalition website. So if you're not familiar with Michael Ware, he was an architect of the Evangelicals for Biden movement. In the 2020 election, he was part of a political action committee that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in ads to try to get Christians not to vote for Trump and to support Biden in the final weeks of the 2020 election in some key swing states.
Right.
So Michael Ware is, he's not just sort of, well, I'm a Democrat because of these few policies. He's a hard political activist. So I think that's something that's very key to know. So when we look at Michael Ware and Tim Keller's support of him and the Gospel Coalition's support of Michael Ware, and then we compare that to their treatment of people who supported Donald Trump, or imagine for a moment the Gospel Coalition featuring a Trump administration staffer in their pages. You would never have seen it, and you never did see it. And so what Tim Keller said, and I think it was in the New Yorker, was that Christians who were supporting Trump were making it harder for other Christians to witness because they were discrediting themselves and because they were grasping for power. And it was so interesting to me that I go, well, one, in a certain respect, yes, every time you support a political candidate, you are doing it so that they will exercise power to enact your policy preferences. That's what politics is. It is the exercise of legislative power. There's really no way around that. Right. So that was one, is anyone who does anything political is always doing it for the purpose of power. But the other side of that coin was how he could then ignore someone like Michael Ware, who's worked in politics his entire life, and instead say that he was sort of a faithful witness in the halls of power, akin to Francis Collins. And the reason that I think that happens is I don't know if it's a conscious process, but I do think there's an awareness that we live in a time right now that is going to reward those who are going along with the cultural zeitgeist. And certainly these are the elites who themselves are in control of every dominant cultural institution: academia, entertainment, government, corporate culture. Really, church culture and, I don't know, country music is the only thing that the left does not control. And so, as I say, I don't know if they very self-consciously went, I'm going to align with the powerful side, but that is essentially what they did. And so the irony of accusing those who have resisted all of these enormous cultural influences and say that they are the people who are scrambling for power is, I think hypocrisy is the kindest word for it. Because we also have to look at the fact that, let's say, if Tim Keller wanted to talk about how Christians were engaging with politics, why was he speaking primarily to a Christian Republican right when the people in his own congregation and under his own influence tended to be of the Democrat left? It would have made much more sense for him to say, here are the blind spots that I think you need to deal with, those of you who are under my care. But instead, he was always speaking more directly to the people who were not at all under his direct care as a pastor and as a ministry leader. And to me, that also bespeaks a certain cowardice.
Yeah, well, Megan, one of the things that will be shocking and hard for some people to admit and acknowledge in your book, but which didn't surprise me, unfortunately, is actually some of the reporting you've done on the political campaign donations that have actually flowed from the congregants at Tim Keller's church. at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And I haven't finished your book yet, but you mentioned this in your book. And Tim Keller himself, before his death, admitted that he was a registered Democrat in the state of New York. I believe his son is as well. And his brainchild, the Gospel Coalition, has massive political campaign donations from guest writers there going to Democrats, and then congregants in his own church. And so I often say when I speak in churches, Megan, is how can we fix what's out there when we can't get it right in here? I shudder to think how many individuals at Tim Keller's church supported abortion and voted for candidates that supported abortion. And he talks about this in an old article from many years ago, from the 90s, about a woman who came to his church who was an ACLU attorney and was pro-abortion, ended up getting saved, and then became pro-life. But she told him, if I had seen any references to the pro-life movement or the unborn child at your church, I would have never come back. And Tim Keller used this as this wonderful example of why clerical silence in the face of child sacrifice is such a beautiful means of evangelism. And so I'm grateful for your commentary on that, because tell me if you think I'm right. Perhaps no one has shifted the Overton window further left in American evangelicalism in the last 30 years than Tim Keller.
No, I think that's probably right, because I think part of the reason that we saw such hagiography, and I think it's being reassessed quickly, but of Tim Keller's impact and his legacy is because he was able to move that Overton window to the left. And there's this default in big evangelicalism, particularly at the Gospel Coalition and Christianity Today, that tends to see things that are more progressive as more intellectual. And I'm not sure why that is, but maybe there's a certain inferiority complex, or there's just a certain desire to be at the cool intellectual kids table. But certainly, if something codes right, it seems to feel to them like it's less intellectually respectable. And so Tim Keller is the icon of intellectually respectable Christianity. And so, part of what I did when I looked into what was going on with Redeemer Church and City to City was to see, okay, what are the staffers there to the degree that I'm able to find? And I dug a lot, and I could not ever find a single one who donated to a Republican. So that was why it was so interesting that Tim Keller was constantly talking about the excesses of the right and never the left, when his own organization was full of Democrats and people who support Democrats, which by nature is going to lead to supporting their policies. And I can kind of see being a registered Democrat in a blue city, because then you have more influence on, okay, the primaries. So I tend not to hold that against people, because I go, I don't know, if I were living in a deep blue city and I thought maybe I could get a less radical candidate by being a registered Democrat and voting in the primary, I might do it. But that argument is undercut when you look at Tim Keller's rhetoric when it comes to political matters, and who he was supposed to be ministering to and who he was supposed to be really preaching to in terms of political convictions, and who he actually spoke to in the pages of The Atlantic, the New York Times, the New Yorker. So, the other thing when I think about Tim Keller, and it's hard, right? Because like so many people, I did benefit from him early in my Christian walk. And there came a moment where I went, I don't understand what's happening here. And I think that was that reassessing of what's happening with Keller. Why is this going on? And I think it's going to continue to go on for a time where we try to understand what was motivating him in those things, particularly towards the end. And I think charitably, I'm going to hope that maybe his illness was impacting some lack of clarity when he spoke about some of these issues, like when he tweeted about abortion, this sort of long tortured thread that seemed to excuse voting for pro-abortion candidates. And when you talk about that ACLU lawyer that came to his church and how she was eventually won over to the pro-life conviction, to the pro-life position, I kind of want to counter that story of a person. I don't know who that is, and I don't know what she might say and how she might describe her views. But I do know someone who is in Tim Keller's church who had a direct opposite trajectory, and that was Kirsten Powers of CNN. So, what we know about Kirsten Powers is that she said she came to faith in his church, that she was in his church for years. And over time, she too became aware of its pro life understanding of scripture, and that she was unsettled by this but continued in the church. She also came to understand that Presbyterians believe that homosexuality is a sin, and she sat with that. And over time, she said, as she came to realize it very slowly, she left the church. And she clearly, in I don't know if you'd call it a remembrance or memorial of Tim Keller, but after he died, she wrote this piece and she said she has left the faith because it was a price she wasn't willing to pay. She didn't count the cost at the outside because she didn't understand the cost of following Christ. So over time, when that was revealed to her, she eventually drifted away. Would her story have been different if she had understood at the very beginning, you are going to be called upon in this blue city, in this blue state that you live in, to take some very unpopular positions, because that's called picking up your cross and following Christ, and that may be required of you. Would she have continued to follow? I don't know. But I know that she's very bitter today, in her own words, about the fact that she felt like Tim and Kathy Keller hid that from her.
Wow. Wow. We're running short on time, Megan, but let me ask you another question. Why isn't Doug Wilson or Jack Hibbs invited to Davos every year?
That's a really good question. I would so love to see that. I'm praying that happens now. You know why? Because I think if you watch what happened at Davos this year, they invited Kevin Roberts. And I would encourage everybody, if you're not familiar with Kevin Roberts, he's a president of the Heritage Foundation. They invited him to come and sort of explain why conservatives think what they think. And Kevin Roberts showed up there. And he was not impressed, obviously, by the pomp and the circumstance and the power and the billions. And he wasn't intimidated by it. And he told them why people of faith, he's Catholic, why Christians generally, if we're talking about mere Christianity, why conservatives think what they think. And he told them exactly what they object to about the WEF's global goals for the nations. And you could see that they didn't know how to respond, that they were completely taken aback by somebody not being dazzled by them. And I think that's why you probably won't see them invite Kevin Roberts back again. And it's why you see them invite Rick Warren and not Doug Wilson. Because Rick Warren, ever since then, really, quite frankly, likes to frequently mention that he's been a Davos speaker and that he's on the Council of Foreign Relations and that he's, very sought after by these international bodies. Well, these international bodies don't want to hear what a Jack Hibbs or a Douglas Wilson has to say. In part, not just because I think they don't want to be exposed to that conflict, but because I think they know it would expose them, because they don't have answers for what a Doug Wilson or a Jack Hibbs would say.
Yep. We'll have to have you on another time, Megan. Let me I'm going to say one more thing. I want you to respond, and then we'll have to say goodbye. Guys, make sure you go get Megan Basham's book, Shepherds for Hire. I look forward to seeing you end of the month, Megan, at Shepherds for Sale. And we'll see you at the end of the month at the Believers Summit with a lot of warriors in Florida. But C.S. Lewis, Megan, once said, of all the passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a man who is not yet a very bad man do very bad things. Your response?
Well, one, I could not agree more with Professor Lewis, but I think part of what I tried to get at in my book is that I don't think there's like a deal with the devil moment. I don't think there's a mustache twirling, hey, give me my big check, or give me my New York Times column, or give me my Trinity Forum fellowship, and I'm going to sell my soul. I don't think that's what's happening. I think very little by little, you see a trajectory and you see a movement in that direction that is born of convincing oneself that, well, actually, I think back in the day, I had it wrong on women pastors, or I may have been a little too harsh on the idea that homosexuality is sin and perversion, or maybe we should use the pronouns, never mind how that impacts children and women. And so little by little, you convince yourself that this is the kind position to take, that this is the intellectual position to take. So that suddenly who you were 15 years ago would not, that man would not recognize the person that you have become today. And I think you've convinced yourself that you're evolving in a positive way. And, so maybe I would just finish that. I think about that a lot myself, because I think about this there, but for the grace of God, what would I do if I were in that position? And, these forces were trying to move me in that direction. And so I just think, you know what, Lord, one, protect me, protect all of us. And then two, just being saturated in scripture and solid teaching. So, I have a lot of go-to favorite pastors and teachers that I listen to just drench my brain in so that it doesn't happen to me.
Yep. Oh, it's always funny, Megan, when men like this, talk about C.S. Lewis and how they've been formed by C.S. Lewis. And it's like, wait, do you mean the C.S. Lewis who said about himself that we simply found ourselves in contact with a certain current of ideas and plunged into it because it seemed modern and successful? We just started automatically writing the kind of essays that got good marks and saying the kinds of things that won applause. We were afraid of a breach with the spirit of the age, afraid of ridicule, and having allowed ourselves to drift, unresisting, accepting every half-conscious solicitation from our desires, we reached a point where we no longer believed the faith. And I just wish that Big Eva would actually take C.S. Lewis's warnings at face value and realize he was talking about you, dude. He's talking about you.
Yeah, I just want to add really quickly, if your position, whatever your positions are, whether it's on COVID vaccines or Black Lives Matter or climate change, if you are aligned with every Fortune 500 company in the country, with most of the world's governments, and with the WEF, maybe you should check that Lewis quote and consider, I don't know, are we the ones who are the cultural capitulators? Maybe you are.
Yeah. I still I've lost friends because I went after Ed Stetzer, Megan, and I'm like, dude, this is the guy who says a man who funds the chopping up of children and tracking the anal sex activity of teenagers and the live dissections of infants who were born alive at the University of Pittsburgh is a faithful, integrity, spirit-filled Christian brother that you can't wait to see how God uses him next. If you talk that way about Joseph Mengele and you put Joseph Mengele on your tithe-funded podcast and you didn't know what Mengele was up to, you owe an apology to the church. And the fact that the dean of Biola's flagship seminary won't apologize to the church, and neither will Russell Moore, neither will David French, neither will these guys. It tells you everything you need to know about them. And guys, if this episode made you upset, go right now, get Megan's book, Shepherds for Sale. Buy a bunch for maybe your weak or woke or wimpy pastor and the friends in your life. This might be one of the most important books written in the last 10 years, and the church needs this right now. So, Megan, thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for probably the blood, sweat, and tears that you poured into this book. And I'm praying that it's the beginning of a cultural shift in the country and in the church today. So thank you.
I am too. And thanks so much for having me, Seth.
Thanks, Megan. We'll see you soon. Thank you guys for joining the show today. Head on over to iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble. Give the show a rating and review. Follow Megan on X, formerly known as Twitter. Buy her book. We'll put all that in the show notes as well. Check out her talk. She's speaking more around the country. Powerful, powerful voice. If you want to protect us from the YouTube, Google, technocratic overlords that have nearly assassinated my YouTube channel, go to Rumble and subscribe to protect us. And if you want to join the White Rose Resistance, go to thewhiterose.life. Become an ally, and you get a battle box in the mail to equip you for the fight, and host a screening of my film, The 1916 Project, at your church this summer. Right now, you can do it right now. Go to the1916project.com and press host a screening, and check out Dr. George Grant, Eric Metaxas, Pastor Jack Hibbs, John Amanchukwu, Nancy Piercy, and many others in the film that we have to get insurance for as we're expecting a Planned Parenthood lawsuit. The 1916 Project, host a screening at your church now. Until next week, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is The Seth Gruber Show.